Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam.
And I'm Maartje.
And we like World War II media and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're covering The Great Escape, a 1963 movie directed by John Sturges and written by James Clavell and W.R. Burnett. It's based on the book The Great Escape by Paul Brickhill, which is a memoir about the mass escape of a group of British Commonwealth prisoners from German POW camp Stalag Luft III in March of 1944. Brickhill was actually an Australian fighter pilot who was shot down over Tunisia in March of 1943. And he assisted in tunneling and security in the planning of the escape, but he wasn't actually able to go on the escape because he was claustrophobic. And he began work on his memoirs while he was still imprisoned, and he had to hide the paper from the guards. And he ended up publishing a book called Escape to Danger in 1946, and then The Great Escape in 1950. What did you think of this movie?
I really enjoyed it, but boy, was it long.
It was long, yeah.
I thought it was really funny. I thought the acting was decent. Enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the background also. Yeah, overall good experience, but it could have been a bit shorter. So I watched the end of it, the last 30 minutes on 3 times the speed. So it was really funny. Yeah, not bad. How about you?
Yeah, it really has sort of boys' own adventure vibes. It's one of those war was fun sort of movies and not super historically accurate. But yeah, it was an enjoyable watch. I mean, they have some good action scenes, particularly towards the end. The planning of the escape is neat to watch. I found a lot of the characters were a bit two-dimensional in the sense that we never really get a peek behind the curtain with a lot of these guys. But overall, an enjoyable watch, I think. Like a good action movie if you're in the mood for that.
Yeah, I guess you don't really get not many character motivations and stuff. They're doing the escape because they are doing the escape.
And I read The Real Great Escape by Guy Walters, which is obviously a book about what actually happened, the events around the escape from Stalag Luft III in March of 1944. And a lot of the myths that have come up in the decades since it happened, a lot of them came from the movie. So a lot of the things that people think are true that actually happened, well, they were actually made up for the movie. And so he goes into detail about some of that too. He talks about, what happened in the movie that wasn't true or was true and that kind of stuff. So it was really interesting read.
All right, so let's get into the movie. The movie starts with a musical opening, a very long but fun scene with a very fun musical bit in which we see a military convoy driving through some pretty countryside, and we see them arrive to Stalag Luft III, and the film has set this opening near the fictional town of Neustadt, but in reality it was near the town of Sagan in Lower Silesia in what was then Nazi Germany, which is now Sagan, Poland. It's about 100 miles southeast of Berlin. As we see these tracks, we also see the introduction of all the actors. Then we see a title card reading that the characters have been amalgamated and timelines have been compressed, but the events that are depicted are true. I thought it was a really enjoyable opening, actually. So they get out of their tracks, and we see all our characters all at once. They get introduced to us one by one, and you can tell everybody all their names.
Yeah, and as the men make their way into the barracks, after they get off the trucks, they're immediately all casing the joint. All the barracks are built up off the ground, and the Germans did that on purpose so that you couldn't tunnel underneath them very easily. So they're checking under the barracks. They're checking. There's this sort of boundary line that's drawn 20 feet in from the fence that clearly you're not supposed to step across. So they're scoping that out. And they're sort of scoping out all the different ways you could potentially escape from the camp. So we're getting a sense of who these guys are right off the top. And the commandant of the camp, who's the Luftwaffe Colonel von Luger, played by Hannes Messemer, he warns the group captain Ramsey that any man who escapes will be shot. And Ramsey mentions the famous sworn duty to escape of all airmen. And he seems pretty chill, pretty lackadaisical about it. And we learn that these new men are all Allied POWs who have repeatedly escaped from camps across the Third Reich. They're all shit disturbers. And von Luger is having this serious chat with Group Captain Ramsey because he's going, look, I want to give you guys access to facilities and tools so you can have fun. Well, not fun, but you have a way to pass the time. But, he sort of wants to have this gentleman's agreement that they're not going to try to escape.
And what I noticed immediately is that Colonel von Luger, he doesn't like the SS or the Gestapo very much. You can tell from the way he's talking about him to Ramsey. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so Colonel von Luger is based on a real person. Friedrich von Lindner was the commandant of the camp. And the Luftwaffe pretty famously consider themselves to be soldiers. And so they believed in this idea of treating other soldiers honorably. If we treat their POWs well, they'll treat our POWs well, that kind of thing. And so they really didn't have any time for the Gestapo. They considered them to be thugs. We're going to find out a little bit later in the movie, but at the time, the Gestapo were threatening to take over the Luftwaffe camps because there had been these escapes and these issues, and the Luftwaffe was very much not into that. And so you can tell that Colonel von Luger is not very happy about the idea that the Gestapo are threatening to shoot people who escape, but he's warning them anyway and making sure that they know about it.
Yes. The word I used to describe Ramsey's talk with von Luger was sassy. I thought he was being very British, but also he had a little bit of an edge, which I quite liked. But anyway, we immediately get to the point. We see a couple of prisoners try to unsuccessfully escape. 2 men start a fight as a diversion, and 2 other men disguise themselves as members of a Russian work party, and they jump into the back of departing trucks with trees on them. Captain Virgil Hiltz, played by Steve McQueen, finds a blind spot at the fence between guard towers where the safety line is, and he purposely gets himself caught by flinging his baseball behind the death wire, as they're called, so he can kind of figure out where the blind spot is. They then toss him in what's called the cooler, and he befriends Flying Officer Archie Ives, played by Angus Lanny, who's in there for generally being a little shit, which he is. Do you want to tell us who we think Steve McQueen's character is based on?
Yeah. So one of the things this movie does is it really overemphasizes the role of Americans in the escape. Actually, I think it was 6 or 7 months before the escape actually happened, the Americans were moved to a separate part of the camp. And so some of them sort of participated in the preliminary stuff, like the planning and the early tunnel digging, but they weren't really a prominent part in the escape itself. But we do think that Captain Hiltz is probably based on several pilots, including David M. Jones, who is actually one of the Doolittle raiders after Pearl Harbor. He was shot down over North Africa, and he led one of the digging teams sort of early in the plan of the Great Escape, as well as Bill Ash, who was an RCAF pilot who escaped so many times they actually awarded him an MBE for it. And he actually did not participate in the Great Escape because he was already in the cooler for another escape attempt.
What's an MBE?
It's a member of the British Empire. It's like,
cool.
Yeah. So it's really like famous people who have done great things for Britain.
Cool. In case you forgot, the Doolittle raid in the Pearl Harbor movie was the raid we thought deserved its own movie. If you listen to that, just for reference. But yeah, it's like, I like the way this movie just gets straight to the point in the beginning, and you kind of find out it's funny. It's not supposed to be funny, obviously, but you can also tell the guards are just really annoyed the entire time.
Yeah, and I get the sense that was pretty true to life. The real life airmen were very fucking annoying when they were in the camps.
I just really enjoyed Hilt's character just stealing the keys right off the card when he was put in the cooler. Like, here you go, your keys back. Funny. The Gestapo bring RAF squadron leader Roger Bartlett, played by Richard Attenborough, to the camp. They've been talking about him before, the prisoners, wondering where he was. They tell von Luger that he's an escapee ringleader, and make it clear that if he tries to escape again, they're not joking about him being shot. I mean, obviously. Von Luger points out that escaped airmen are the responsibility of the Luftwaffe, and gets told basically not for long.
Yes, it's very ominous, because normally, I mean, if they're the responsibility of the Luftwaffe and they get caught, all that happens is they get sent back to the camp and they get thrown in the cooler. But if they can get handed over to the Gestapo, that's not going to be good news.
It almost feels like a little bit of a game, these escapes. Like, they're making it seem like it's this funny, enjoyable thing to do, but in real life, it probably would have been pretty damn scary to try and escape.
Yeah, lots of dudes did try it. Actually, the group captain, Ramsey, is based on Group Captain Herbert Massey, but also on Wing Commander Harry Day. His nickname was Wings Day. Just to give you like a little tidbit about this guy, one of his friends said that it was good that he was shot down in a POW camp because there was no alcohol available. Otherwise, he would have drank himself to death because he was such a partier. And so this guy was well known. He had staged a mass breakout earlier in 1943, and he had escaped quite a few times and was known for this sort of behavior. So even the guys who were in charge, who were supposed to be keeping everybody in line, were getting involved in these shenanigans.
What an excellent name, by the way, to call him Wings Day.
Yeah.
Just awesome.
Roger Bartlett is based on Roger Bichelle, and you can see he's got a little scar by his eye because Roger Bichelle was actually in a skiing accident and he refused treatment. He was in Canada at the time, I believe, and he wouldn't let them treat it until he got back to the UK and he got an eye infection. So he had kind of a messed up eye. So we see that in the movie. And he was known for being really the great mind behind The Great Escape.
Yeah. He talks to what's his name, Ramsey, and I get a sense that he would much rather than wait so long and escape. He wants to get his revenge or to get out quickly at first, and then he, of course, gets told by Ramsey that it's not just him on the line.
Bushell knows a bunch of the men at the camp already, of course, and at the previous camp, they'd had an organization that they called X Organization, and that was their group that had been planning these escapes, and he wants to plan a massive breakout this time. He wants to get hundreds of men out of the camp. And his reasoning is that it will help the Allied war effort because it will divert German manpower. They also sort of talk about how it's about honor. And like, as you said, him wanting to get revenge a little bit, to get out of the camp, to mess with the Germans. And Ramsey does approve of this plan, but he also warns of the dangers that are obviously present.
So many men, 250 men. It sounds like impossible to me. Yeah. The men gather to discuss this plan. We obviously don't see all 250 of them, but we get like the main characters. They discuss the fact that they'll have to dig down to avoid being overheard 335 feet to the tree line, so that's a long way. They have to dig 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry. And they also need substantial supplies, papers, clothing, and money for when they get out.
Yeah, and they have, all of these guys have their different special skills. We have Flight Lieutenant Bob Henley, played by James Garner, and he is the guy who sort of knows how to work the black market. He's called the Scrounger. We have Flight Lieutenant Colin Blythe, played by Donald Pleasance, and he's a forger because, of course, they need identification cards, they need tickets, they need all kinds of stuff if they're going to make it in the civilian world. And Blythe and Henley actually become close friends when Blythe approaches Henley to get him a camera to assist in his work, and this is going to come back later, the friendship between these two guys. Haynes, who's played by Lawrence Montaigne, and Day Nimmo, played by Tom Adams, are in charge of diversions, which seems to be just a fancy name for causing shit. Flying Officer Sedgwick, played by James Coburn, manufactures steel picks and air bellows. Flight Lieutenant Willie Dix, played by John Layton, and Flight Lieutenant Danny Walensky, played by Charles Bronson, are responsible for tunneling. And Willie Dix is actually based on Wally Floody, who is a Canadian fighter pilot from Northern Ontario. And you know I love a Canada mention and an extra love a Northern Ontario mention. And the real Wally was actually also a technical advisor on the film, so that's pretty cool. And we also have Flight Lieutenant Andy McDonald, played by Gordon Jackson. He gathers intelligence. He's sort of like Bushell's right-hand man. We have Officer Griffith, played by Robert Desmond. He's making all the civilian disguises because, of course, all they have are uniforms and they need to be able to blend in when they get out. And we have Flight Lieutenant Dennis Cavendish, played by Nigel Stock, who is the surveyor for the tunnel routes.
So if you watch this movie on Amazon Prime, you can turn on X-Ray, which will show you at all times which characters are in the scene, and it says also what they do. So in case you forget, because there's a lot of characters, I found this really helpful. We see them do various shenanigans, causing a diversion with a spraying water tap so they can steal parts from a car, building a well-disguised trap door under a stove, establishing a sentry and code system so they can warn each other when the ghosts are coming. So plenty of fun stuff to watch for.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that they showed how they made the trap doors, as well as a little bit later you see how the trolleys going into the tunnel and how they were getting the dirt out and how they were dispersing the dirt and all this other stuff. I thought that was cool because they explained it in the book, but it's sort of hard to picture. And it really is kind of ingenious. Different things that they did to cover up what they were doing.
For a movie that's so old, it's filmed really well as well. It's really smart, I feel, the way it's filmed. It's quite fun.
Yeah. So we have Hiltz and Ives, and of course, Hiltz is our Steve McQueen character. He's very independent. He wants to escape. So Hiltz and Ives started planning their own escape. And the X organization, they don't love this because they would prefer to focus everyone's time and resources on, the main escape. But they don't try to stop him. They think if the Germans catch him, it's going to throw him off the scent of their tunnel. And of course, Hiltz and Ives are recaptured and tossed in the cooler, which is a pretty common thing to happen to them.
Yeah, that escape sounded so crazy. I was like, it's never going to work. But yeah. So they've gotten quite used to the cooler, I think. Isn't he called like the Cooler King or something in the credits?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Lieutenant Commander Eric Ashley Pace, played by David McCallum, he figures out how to hide all the dirt that they've dug up in a really clever way. The Germans definitely guess something is up because all the men are suddenly into gardening, which doesn't seem like them. Flight Lieutenant Dennis Cavendish, played by Nigel Stark, leads a choir to cover the noise of the men building the air ducts out of milk tins. So it's all very clever, and I'm sure some of this was real as well. You would know, you've read the book.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of this stuff is real. The dirt dispersal system where they were carrying it out in their pant legs and then sort of slowly releasing it, that was real. And the building the air ducts out of milk tins was real. And yeah, I think it's really funny because at the beginning, the camp commandant is like, I want you guys to be doing activities to take your mind off being a POW and not try to escape, but I'll let you guys have all these tools to do stuff. And then they're taking him up on it in the sense that they're gardening and they have a choir and whatever. But the Germans so clearly can tell that they're being little shit. They're planning something.
And it's so funny because he literally says, I'm going to give you tools for gardening. Please use them for gardening in the very first conversation they have. I was live blogging my reactions to you as I was watching the film. And I said, well, at least it's giving them a purpose. Even if they don't end up escaping, at least they get to do something useful in the camp.
Yeah, that was one of the things. A lot of the guys talked about, if you didn't have something to do, then really quickly the psychological stress was quite a lot. And so part of building these tunnels and coming up with these plans was also, if you don't do something, you're going to lose your mind a little bit.
Yep. It happens later, by the way. We'll get there. Blythe pretends to deliver a lecture on bird calls when the guard comes in, but really they're discussing the need for new identification cards. Handley has a couple of examples of these papers, which he has acquired by misleading this camp guard called Werner, who's also called the Ferret, and who's played by Robert Kraft. Griffith is working on modifying the clothing they have. He's really excited about this clothing. It's so they can look less military, as we've already said, and they can pass as civilians after they get out of that camp.
Yeah, so a lot of this stuff is true. They did have a lecture. One of them had a fake lecture that he was going to give on Siam, which I believe is modern day Thailand. He had all ready to go. He was going to start delivering it if any of the guards came in. And there were camp guards who helped them out with the identification, but actually some of the camp guards helped them without being manipulated into it. So there was one in particular who would literally lend them his pass. And then they would take it and they would skim a little piece off of it so they knew like the exact color and texture and this kind of stuff. And if they needed like a template for something, they would write out what they needed. And then he would take it home. His wife would type it up on her typewriter and he would bring it back. So there was definitely guards in the camp who were like actively helping them to escape. And part of it was some of them really did have anti-fascist ideals. And then there were some of them as well who were just really easy to bribe. They were like, yeah, okay, like you guys are getting these Red Cross packages. You have chocolate, cigarettes, all this stuff that we want. Like, sure, we don't really care. We'll help you with stuff if you give us stuff in return. We see this happening in the film too. We see Handley bribing Werner with chocolate that he's acquired, and also I think butter that was made for the colonel. And it's sneaky, but also funny. Then later when Handley has the papers, as an example, he tells the other guys that the papers are on loan, which is probably a little nod to the fact that some of the guard actually try to help. Yeah. I like that. Bartlett asks Hiltz, who is planning another escape, because of course he is, to scout the area and draw them a map by jumping the fence like he's planned, and then, scouting the area and figuring out, where the train station is, how to get through the woods, all that stuff, and then letting himself be recaptured so that he can give them this map. And he's impressed by the magnitude of their escape. And he's like, it's absolutely wild. You're trying to get hundreds of dudes out of here. That sounds great. Good for you. I'm not interested in being involved. He also notes that, quote unquote, every goon in the country will be after you. And that is definitely some foreshadowing, because that is definitely what happens. Can we talk briefly about what a Hollywood kind of character this has helped? It's just, to me, it's like a rebel without a cause kind of deal. He's just so Hollywood. Yeah, he's certainly a very, he's an archetype. He's a character that you will recognize from other action movies, westerns, that kind of thing. Handley offers to take Werner's wallet
that he stole Werner thought was missing back to him so he can get back into his favor, and also pull some favors because they need a camera to take photos for identification papers. We see the ingenious system of the man using a trolley system to get the earth out of the tunnel into an underground holding room. The tunnel partially collapses, and they realize they need more wood to brace the walls and ceilings. They begin to rip wood out of the ceilings, the walls, and the beds, and there's a funny little moment too when there's been wood taken out of the beds and someone tries to get on the bed and they just collapse, and it's funny.
Yeah, that also is taken from real life. A lot of the escape stuff is taken from real life because honestly, in some of these cases, like truth would be stranger than fiction. Some of the stuff these guys thought of was really clever.
Yeah, I'm like, how can this be real? It's how did the guards not notice? It's ingenious.
The absolutely wild thing, too, is that, we already talked about how the Germans built the barracks up on top of posts so that it would be obvious if people were digging underneath. But the Germans also had microphones under the ground so they could hear when people were digging. And it's interesting because now we think maybe they had bribed some of the Germans who were responsible for listening to the microphone and reporting noises. There was a part where right before the tunnel was finished, the microphone was actually turned off for a little while because the camp guards were adding sort of like a new section to the network. And so they had shut it off. So there was all these like little different things, like little reasons why the noises weren't picked up on the microphones. And sometimes the noises were picked up on the microphones and the Germans would come do a search and they wouldn't find anything because the tunnels were so well hidden. So it's really interesting that the Germans really were, it was a little bit of a game of cat and mouse. It's funny because when they would find a tunnel or something, they would almost be gleeful about it. There's pictures of, the Germans sort of like popping their heads out of the tunnel and being like, haha, look at this, we caught them again, sort of thing.
Oh my god. Yeah, that's kind of funny. Sometimes you almost forget this isn't a game. It's war and these guys are imprisoned and it's a serious business. But the movie doesn't help in making you realize how serious this was, really. It's a really funny movie. But Tom is almost finished, one of the tunnels, so they seal off Dick and Harry. By the way, Tom, Dick and Harry is a very British expression for just every man, basically.
What's funny as well is that these guys weren't the only ones to name their escape tunnels Tom, Dick, and Harry.
Really?
Yeah, it happened more than once.
The three Americans in the camp, Hilt, Handley, and Second Lieutenant Goff, played by Judd Taylor, reminded me very much of George Last, by the way. We celebrate the 4th of July with homemade moonshine and parade. When this happens, the guards stumble upon the tunnel that's almost done, which is really sad. Because Eves, who had gotten sold on the idea of escaping through this tunnel, who was already kind of on the edge, he freaks out and he decides to climb the fence and is unfortunately killed in the process.
And this is based on something that really did happen to that guy named Jimmy Kittle, who tried to climb the fence and was killed.
So Hilt, who had befriended him, kind of changes his mind at that stage and decides to help them.
So there are two other tunnels, Dick and Harry. They're backup contingency tunnels. So they reopen Harry. While they're working on it, Walensky, who's one of the main tunneler guys, his claustrophobia surfaces when a tunnel collapses. And he kind of freaks out and tries to climb the fence too. But his friend Dix, who's the other tunneler guy, manages to stop him and talk him down. Blythe, meanwhile, he's been working so hard on his forgery documents. He unfortunately discovers that he's going blind.
Bartlett tries to tell him that he can't come on the escape.
But Henley steps in and says, look, we'll take him on the escape. I'm going to help him.
So Walensky and Dix are also known as Willie and Danny in the movie, in case you got confused. Which I did, so I'm just referring to them as Willie and Danny. And what is it with Blythe's and bad eyesight?
It was so weird because 1 second he's looking at this identification card and he's talking to this other guy who's done forgery work and he's like, oh, you forgot to do this one part of the card. And the guy's like, dang it, shucks. And then the next minute he's like, oh no, I can't see a thing. And literally like blind, like he's tripping over stuff. And it's just like, I don't fully know where this came from, but.
You feel bad for him because he's a gentle character. He seems kind of like smart and you kind of want him to make it. I was very happy when Handley decided to help him and to stick his neck out for him. So eventually they complete the tunnel, Harry, and they try to escape. The real-life tunnel was 344 feet long, required 2,000 bedboards, 500 feet of wiring, 750 klim tins. Klim is milk spelled backwards, 370 feet of rope, and the dispersal of 130 tons of sand. And 600 men worked on the escape. It's just insane to me.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of men in the camp who had no interest in escaping and thought it was a foolhardy endeavor. But of course, by and large, they kept their mouths shut, and they might be willing to help out here and there, even though they weren't interested in participating. It was really this idea that every single person wanted to escape or felt it was their duty to escape is not quite accurate.
No, but like we said before, it gave them a purpose and it kept them busy and distracted. And I think that might have been why they wanted to help anyway, to keep themselves busy. So as they're starting to go in the tunnel, Walensky or Danny panics due to his claustrophobia and he decides he has to go back out.
They were choosing guys to go on the escape. They did it as a sort of lottery system. And so what they did was they chose, the 20 guys who were the most immediately involved in the escape. They did like a lottery and they chose like 15 of those. And then the next ring out, they chose X percentage of those guys to go. And so it was like a lottery system, but you weren't allowed to be in the lottery system if you were claustrophobic, because they were like, anyone who freaks out down there is going to get us in trouble. And so Walensky might be based on Brickhill himself, who, as we said at the beginning, didn't actually go on the escape because he was claustrophobic, or might be based on Alex Cassie, who was a forger instrumental in the escape, who actually chose to remain behind because he couldn't face the tunnel. And of his, I believe, 6 roommates who escaped, 4 of them were shot.
That's insane. Wow. I feel like Walensky or Danny as a character is the most emotional we see, I guess maybe with life as well. You get a little bit of their thoughts on the whole thing. So I felt for him. I was like, oh God, please let him make it out. But obviously, it has to be this way that Hiltz is the first one out because he's a Hollywood guy. And he discovers that the tunnel ends 20 feet short of the forest. It was the plan to make it all the way into the forest, but they didn't manage. Dix manages to talk to Walensky and talks him into going into the tunnel after all. 76 men are able to make it out before Cavendish fucks up by making a noise accidentally. When a guard comes to investigate, Griffith pops out of the tunnel and is captured. It reminds me a little bit of what happened in Red Tails. It happens almost the same way.
I suspect that particular plot line from Red Tails is probably loosely based on this. But yeah, in real life, they were actually behind schedule coming out of the tunnel because when they got to the end where the trap door was, they hadn't tried to open it in a while and it was stuck. So it took them a couple hours to get the door unstuck. And once that happened, they were super behind schedule. And eventually daylight came and one of the guards looked out and was able to see, because this is not the case in the movie, but in real life, there was like a couple feet of snow on the ground because it was March. And the guard looked out in the daylight and was able to see these sort of like trenches in the snow where all the guys had crawled into the tree line, and he could see like the vapor of warmth coming out of the hole in the snow. And so, it was able to catch them.
Oh man. So we watch Walensky, Dix, and Cedric make it to freedom with some help from the resistance. This is based on the real experiences of Jens Muller, Per Bergslund, and Bob Vanderstock. The rest are unfortunately less lucky.
Yeah, so the 3 who they call it making a home run. So they actually escaped and managed to stay escaped. Jens Muller and Per Bergslund were Norwegian, and they managed to escape on a Swedish ship to Sweden. Part of the reason why they were successful to begin with was because they could just pass as Norwegian workers. They didn't have to change their nationality. They already spoke the language and everything like that. And they just got lucky when they got to, so there were a few other guys in the escape who had also made it to the town where they were supposed to hook up with the resistance, but they'd been given the wrong address. These guys started knocking on doors because they were like, well, we got to get in off the street. And then they found the real address. But the other guys who went there weren't able to find the resistance. And unfortunately, they got caught. And Bob Vanderstock was Dutch. He knew some people he had gone to university in Utrecht, I think. And so he was able to meet up with some friends and they hooked him up with the Dutch resistance. And of course, he already spoke Dutch and all this stuff. And so these 3 guys, just situation, but also they were lucky because of their identities and that helped them to escape.
So is his name spelled with his last name all connected like that? Vanderstock, or is it Vanderstock?
So that's how it's spelled in the book, but I have a hunch that that might be an anglicization.
Cool, I'll look him up. I'm interested now. Cavendish is turned in by a truck driver as he hitches a ride. The Gestapo initially accuses him of being a spy due to his altered uniform. I guess that makes sense. Hiltz tries to evade soldiers on a stolen motorcycle, but is caught before he makes it to the burner. And this is funny because this didn't happen in real life. It's just that Steve McQueen really wanted to ride a motorcycle, so he made it a condition of his taking the role that he would get to ride a motorcycle, which is so Hollywood. It just made me laugh so much.
It is funny. It's so this motorcycle chase and jump scene is considered one of the greatest stunts ever performed. And the jump itself is actually done by stuntman Bud Ekins because due to insurance reasons, McQueen wasn't allowed to do the jump. But he did all of the other sort of hot rod riding the motorcycle around.
And it's just funny because I watched this bit 3 times the speed. So all I saw was him just bouncing up and down the hills.
Just like the Benny Hill song is on.
Yes, it's just amazing. And the people we wanted to make it most, Hadley and Blythe, steal a plane, and unfortunately it crashes, and Blythe is killed, and it made me really sad. Ashley Pitts kills a Gestapo guard at the station to save Bartlett, but he is himself unfortunately killed. Bartlett and MacDonald are caught when MacDonald accidentally speaks English. It's funny because he's the one I think that warns another guy earlier in the movie about accidentally speaking English. And then they are gathered together at Gorlitz prison. Where is Gorlitz prison? You probably know where this is.
It's literally, most of them didn't make it more than like probably 50 to 80 miles from the prison camp, like even the ones who got trains and stuff like that. So it was basically like the nearest prison large enough to house prisoners. And actually, interestingly, the bit where Bartlett and MacDonald get caught because MacDonald accidentally speaks English. So this is sort of loosely based on what really happened. But when Bushell escaped, he was actually with a Frenchman. And so the story came out that the Frenchman accidentally said yes in English. But if you think about it, is the Frenchman likely to say yes in English when he's speaking French to someone else? Like, chances are that if that did happen, it was Bushell who made the mistake. But anyway, it's basically this story as it appears in the movie came down as gospel, and a lot of people believe that it's true, but it didn't happen quite this way.
No, it doesn't really make sense. 50 of them are put in a truck or a couple trucks, and they are driven out to a field, and I think it's Bartlett who asked, "Where are we going? What's happening?" And then they're taken out of the truck and they're shot. And we go back to the camp and we see Von Luger telling this to Ramsey. And he asks how many of the 50 are wounded. And Von Luger just tells him none. And then he tells him he's been ordered to only tell him who the men are that are killed. And it's very unlikely that 50 men would be shot trying to escape and wouldn't leave a single survivor. So it's obvious what has happened, even though he can't say it out loud. Handley survives and returns to the camp with a small group of remaining survivors, and he asks Ramsey if he thinks the escape was worth it.
Yeah, the part where Von Luger tells Ramsey about the deaths, and Ramsey says, well, how many were wounded? And, Von Luger says, well, no one. And Ramsey's like, no one was wounded? That is pretty much taken directly from real life. That actually happened. That was Ramsey coming to this horrified understanding that these men were executed summarily by the Gestapo.
Yeah, and in the movie, Von Luger looks really apologetic and sad about it too. Which I'm guessing he would have been because, as you've told me, these men, these guards and officers they had a sense of honor. They felt like there were laws and there were ways to treat prisoners and you should do it that way. And the Gestapo obviously did not.
Yes, the real-life camp commandant von Lindener, he actually put forward the funds for the men to build a memorial for the 50 who were killed, which still stands today. And the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, essentially put out a message when the Gestapo tried to cover this all up, being like, this stinks. We also think it's bullshit. We didn't want this to happen, and we're not in on it.
It's rough. Then if you think about it, you finally make it out of the camp, And then you think, well, I'm just going to go back to the camp again and I'll just try again. But you don't get there and you get killed. It's just rough.
And
Luger is relieved of his command and the Gestapo take over the camp. So you know it's only going to get worse from there. Hilt is sent to the cooler again and immediately begins planning another escape. End card reads, "This picture is dedicated to the 50."
It really cracked me up at the end how the Steve McQueen character is getting thrown back in the cooler, and it's a throwback to the beginning of the movie, and this jaunty sort of music is being played. And I'm like, 50 men were just executed in a field. Like, is this... the vibe was strange for the ending of the movie, I'll say that.
Yeah, I agree. And then, of course, the end card comes right away, and it's just so weird to have that happy, cheery jaunt on there. Yeah, it's a long movie, guys. It's a good movie, but it's long. And it's very much a product of its time. We'll say this many times on the podcast. Sometimes it's just very obvious when something is made.
So, as I said, I read the book The Real Great Escape, and they had some stuff in there that I thought was neat or explained what happened in the movie a little bit better. So, in the movie itself, the escape takes place and the weather seems fine. But in real life, it was the coldest winter in 30 years, which did not bode well for the men. But they ended up choosing this date right at the end of March for a few reasons. The first of which, there was this guard called the Ferret, Corporal Grease, and he had gone on vacation for 2 weeks. So while he was gone, the men had more leeway to pretty much go balls to the wall and dig that tunnel and get it done. But then when he came back, he was more suspicious than ever. So he did like a 4-hour search of this hut and he didn't find the tunnel, but it really made the men nervous. And some of the men had also been selected to be moved to a new camp because the camp leadership, they were like, look, we know something is going to happen. It's like separating the bad kids who sit together in the classroom, right? They're like, we got to move some of these guys somewhere else. And so knowing that the Germans were so suspicious made the escape urgent. Otherwise, it probably would be better to wait for better weather. And also the night that they chose, there was going to be no moon. And unfortunately, when they escaped, a lot of the guys got caught. Like some of the guys were so cold that they turned themselves in. Some of the guys just didn't make the progress they thought they were going to make because that's what happens when you're walking through the forest in a few feet of snow. And some of the guys were forced to walk on the roads because the weather was so bad. And so really, it was not probably the best time to be doing this.
The question, real quick, the thing where Hilt escapes and gets caught again, did that happen on purpose like that in real life?
No.
Right.
No. Yeah. There's, in
the movie, they need that information to be able to know where to go.
Yeah. I think what they don't really depict in the movie is that the camps were actually pretty impressive hubs of information. So they would get information from the camp guards, from newly downed airmen. Sometimes the guys would manage to make radios like we saw in Masters of the Air, or they would be able to get, newspapers and that sort of thing smuggled in. And what they would do as well is they would smuggle information out to the British Secret Service, MI9. And so the camps are actually sources of like recon and information for spies. And so they actually did have quite a lot of information there. So it wouldn't be surprising if they already knew sort of the layout of the general area.
Just because of so many people coming and going and bringing information and taking information. Yeah, that makes sense. By the way, I heard you say something. You've seen Masters of the Air?
I know. We can't joke about it anymore because I finally watched it.
Wow. Okay, let's continue. We'll get to Masters of the Air when we get to Masters of the Air.
Yeah, so on March 4th, 1944, the famous Bullet Decree was issued by Heinrich Müller, who was the head of the Gestapo. And essentially that dictated that if a British or American officer or NCO was picked up, they were to be handed over to the Gestapo. Bad news. And if an Allied officer or NCO who is not British or American got picked up, they were to be taken, do not pass go, do not collect $200, right to Mauthausen concentration camp and shot. And so if you're thinking, this sounds like a war crime, it is. It's not. This is not legal.
So let me for a second remind everyone about Mauthausen, because this concentration camp, y'all, this is brutal. There's a movie about this that I haven't seen yet. But I think this is also the camp where POWs were made to carry like huge bricks to build an idyllic town in the image that Hitler wanted. And there's this famous image of this, and you can look it up if you look for the photographer of Mauthausen. can look up this image and it'll give you chills. Like, people were treated really badly and obviously also murdered. So it's not a fun time to get stuck there.
No, absolutely not. And unfortunately for our escaping airmen as well, the Gestapo and the Kripo, who were the German police, they had a very effective nationwide search system where anytime there was an escape or any kind of emergency like that, they had 3 levels of severity. And the Grossfendung, which was the highest level, this was only carried out super rarely. It had been used in March of 1943 when 43 Allied airmen tunneled out of Zubin, another camp, and they caught everybody. And it was actually so effective that when they carried out one of these, they also usually caught foreign workers who had left their posts and criminals who were wanted by the police and spies. Like, they would catch a bunch of people they weren't even trying to catch. And so when they set the alarm system to this level, when the great escapers escaped, they had caught 61 out of 76 of them within the first 48 hours.
Like, once that happened, everybody would get caught.
Okay, I need to read this to you because it's so funny. So just to give you an idea of how much you are fucked, when they raise this level of alarm, the following agencies would be alerted: the Gestapo, the Kripo, the regular police, the rural police, the Motor Transport Service, the Ministry of Finance, the Frontier Patrol Service, the Ministry of Transport, the Hunting Office, the chiefs of mobilized formations and organizations, the Security Service, the Waterways Protection Police, the Customs Frontier Guards, the Railway Police, the Railways Protection Service, the National Fire Protection Police, the Air Raid Precaution Police, the Volunteer Fire Brigade, the Technical Emergency Corps, the Auxiliary Rural Police, the State and Civil Forest and Hunting Protection Service, the National Labor Service, the General SS, the SA, the Nazi Motor Corps, the Nazi Aviation Corps, the Hitler Youth Patrol Service, the Armed Forces, the Waffen SS, the Army Patrol Service, and finally the Auxiliary Mountain Police.
Wow, what's going on the trailer?
So it was right. You're gonna get caught, man. There's no way that you're not gonna get caught. And one of the things you'll notice too is that none of those people are frontline German soldiers. And so this whole reasoning where they were like, let's do a mass breakout because it's gonna pull Germans away from the front lines and it's gonna help the Allied war effort, actually did not help the war effort at all, because no soldiers who were occupied on the front lines were used in this search. And actually probably ended up helping the Germans because, as I said before, in their search, they managed to find a bunch of other people that they were also looking for.
Wow, I know I'm laughing, but it's really not funny.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little funny.
You know what? The unfortunate thing, too, is that even the German camp guards and the commandants were constantly telling these guys, like, look, if you're going to escape, because we know you guys are going to try it, do it in small groups, because that way they're not going to raise this huge alarm, and it will also save our asses because the Gestapo won't come down here for a couple of guys. But if you do this mass breakout shit, then it's all of our asses. And of course, the Roger Bushells of the world did not listen to these warnings at all.
No. I wonder if it was almost like, if you hear how many times these guys have tried to escape, they were just sick of escaping. And it was just like, well, we're going to do this one big one. And if this doesn't work, then forget it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they escaped on March the 24th. And then on March 27th, Himmler issued a top secret order that more than half of the escapees who had been captured were to be shot while being returned to their camp under the pretense that they had tried to escape again. And then, as we know from the movie, 50 of them were killed. Unfortunately for the Gestapo, a whole bunch of nearly identical reports about airmen being fatally shot while trying to escape is hella suspicious. And the Swiss, who were neutral and were going around and they would send guys to inspect and monitor the camps, they were like, well, this seems fishy. So they launched an investigation, which led to a massive outcry in Britain. Everyone was finding out about this. The German government claimed that they were conducting their own investigation, but really what they were doing was they were trying to root out German Luftwaffe officers and camp guards who had assisted the escapers. No part of their investigation was about catching these Gestapo guys because they knew that the order had come from on high for this to happen. And the Gestapo tried to fabricate all these reports being like, oh, actually, did we say shot trying to escape? What we actually meant was died in a car accident, or like, oh, sorry, accident. Actually, this guy got caught in a fire. Their efforts to forge these documents were just absolutely absurd.
I also wonder if they were like legitimately a little bit afraid of the Gestapo, because I would be. I mean,
what do you
mean? The Germans, if they were just like, we're just going to do this investigation, but we're not going to piss off the Gestapo too much.
Unfortunately, we know that Hitler was in the room when these decisions were being made. And so the decision really came from like the very top most. And then after the war, During the Nuremberg trials, the RAF Special Investigation Branch formed an investigatory committee, and 18 of the murderers were caught and tried in sort of like a first round of trials during the Nuremberg trials. And these guys, their defense was, well, we knew that the Gestapo would kill us if we didn't follow orders. And, the whole classic, we were just following orders thing. But that defense didn't work for them. And most of those first 18 met the hangman. And then over the next series of trials, they caught 3 more guys. But basically what happens is that as we move away from World War II, the political will to kill people decreases. And so the 3 guys who were caught sort of before the subsequent round of trials, they did prison time, but they weren't killed. And then over the subsequent 20 years or so, they caught 3 more of them. But like one of the guys, they didn't even try him. And, the other guy didn't do any time and that sort of thing. And so they by no means caught everybody, but the investigator committee actually did. They talk about it a lot in the book about all the, pretty incredible detective work they had to do in order to catch these guys who had pretty much the best forged documents that you could get in post-war Germany, because they had the machinery of the Gestapo at their disposal. So they were pretty good at hiding.
I think you said something about this in our last podcast or one before that, about what you just said about the will to kill people. It's also because they needed it after the war, right? And the longer they would keep prosecuting these people, the harder it would be to move on from the war. So it's a tricky situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the cast members served in World War II. I think you had read something about Richard Attenborough.
I did. I just already can't remember, which is great.
Yeah. He served. Pleasance and Bronson also served. Mesmer had served on the German side, of course, but he actually did escape from a Russian POW camp. And another one of the Germans who played the guard Frick, Tillman Kiever, he is the one who discovers the escape in the movie. He actually spent time in a POW camp in Colorado, and he escaped several times using some of these shenanigans that these guys used in the actual movie.
Yeah, I kind of enjoy that. It's not that far from the war, and still these guys are working on a movie together, like Americans and Germans. So the music in this film was funny at times and also very dramatic at other times. It was composed by Elmer Bernstein, who gave each major character their own musical motif based on the Great Escape's main theme. And you'll know this theme, I think, when you hear it, because I'd never seen The Great Escape, but I had heard the theme before in something. I just enjoy it a lot.
I feel like it's quite famous. Like it will probably be familiar to people, even if you haven't recently seen the movie or, you've never seen the movie.
Right. So we have to rate this movie. And Sam had a brilliant idea what to rate it out of. Go on.
We're going to rate it Steve McQueen mandatory death-defying motorcycle stunts out of 10.
I haven't actually given this any thought because I just finished the movie. I think I really enjoyed it, but it was kind of long. I think I'm going to give it 7 Steve McQueen's mandatory death-defying motorcycle stunts out of 10.
Yeah, it's funny. I was also going to give it a 7. I think that it's a really good action movie, except for the part where the guys get shot at the end. And even that happens off screen. It's not like directly violent. And so it's almost like a family-friendly action movie, I feel. The characters are very recognizable. They're always making little jokes. And yeah, it's a fun watch. Not necessarily very historically accurate, except the part where they're planning the escape. A lot of that stuff, they managed to fit some real stuff into the movie there. But yeah, I'll give it a 7. I don't think the characters were that deep, and we've talked before about how we like more character-driven stuff. But yeah, overall, I enjoyed.
I feel like it's similar in this way to our Elizabeth Serbo movie, and I guess it's also made in a similar time. So the characters are fun, but they're not very developed. So I agree with you there. Overall, I would say it's a fun watch, but you can't just watch it on a whim because it's so long. So don't be like me and watch it 2 seconds before you have to record a podcast about it.
Yeah, but this movie is quite popular. It was one of the highest grossing movies of 1963, and I know tons of people who have seen it, so it's a pretty popular movie. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's one of those World War II watches that you should probably have in your repertoire.
They made a part 2, right?
Sort of. So the guy who played Goff in this movie, Judd Taylor, he directed it's not really a sequel because they include the escape, but it's more about the investigatory committee afterwards, who were these cops who had come from Britain to try and track down these Gestapo guys who had committed the murders. So it sounds interesting, but it came out in the 80s, has Christopher Reeve in it, but it was made for TV. It's not quite as popular as this one.
Oh no, that's a bad sign. It has made me want to watch The Great Escaper with, I think, Michael Caine in it, which is fairly new. So maybe we can watch that in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. So I am going to get packing because I leave for London in 2 days. I'm going to We Have Race Fest, so maybe I'll see some of you there. Who knows? Are you reading anything?
Yeah, so I'm reading Extraordinary Women, Extraordinary Times, Canadian Women of World War II by Sherry Pringle. And I am reading that because in a couple of weeks, we are going to be covering Bomb Girls, which I'm very excited about.
Yay, I'm also watching that. I'm trying to get there in time this time. So hopefully I'll manage. So all that's left is for us to thank you for listening. You can get our podcast wherever you get your podcast. You can rate us 5 stars if you really like it. You can also find us on IMDb. You can talk to us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com.
Yes, we are posting book reviews, so there's going to be some more stuff available on the website that's definitely worth checking out.
Yes, do. I spend lots of time on this thing, so please do. Okay, see you next week, guys.
Bye.